And hello, everyone. Welcome to our fourth and final episode. Theology Without Walls is the topic, it's the movement, and Presence is contributing as best we can to this conversation. And today, our final episode is going to be a transnarrative approach to theology without walls. So let me just get started and let's talk about, I've got some slides. I got a number of slides today to talk about this idea of a transnarrative approach. What is it, and how does it relate to the biblical narrative, and especially how's it going to relate to other narratives, which is a topic that we now really need to discuss, because Christianity has been so compartmentalized that it's been difficult to have discussions with folks who have other narratives. So I want to start with Dr. Jerry Martin's quote that I've read before, but I want to start one more time with it because Jerry is spearheading this theology without walls, and he asks the question, is TWW a form of comparative theology, where we're comparing theologies with other religions? His answer is yes, if it is understood as a comparative theology without walls. But it is an alternative to those forms of comparative theology that are essentially confessional, seeking to enhance one's theology by studying another tradition. So what Jerry is challenging people within the walls of their own religion and the associated theology. He's saying, look, we've done comparative theologies where people compare Christian theology, Buddhist theology, Hindu theology, et cetera, et cetera. But we want to go beyond the walls of a theology as a religion. And this is what Presence has been saying for some time. So I have a few considerations right off the bat about narratives in general. Narratives are attempts for human beings to make meaning out of encounters with ultimacy. Human beings have been having these transcendent, divine, God experiences, however we want to refer to that, since the beginning of time. As a matter of fact, some of the first evidences we have of these encounters with the divine come in the form of paintings on the wall of a cave. And from there, of course, it went to tribal storytellers. But human beings across the planet, without any division or without there being any vacancy of it, are experiencing some type of ultimacy. These narratives are interpreting human experiences. Human beings are having experiences of the ultimate. As a matter of fact, the biblical narrative is a collection of human experiences with God, human experiences with the ultimate. You have Father Abraham, who has an experience of God that he needs to go out. He needs to go to a place where he's being guided, or Moses is having this big experience on Mount Sinai. Or the prophets, they wrote a narrative to Israel. They put things in writing, but that writing would typically start with a phrase, something like, "And the word of the Lord came to me saying." They're having an experience of God that turns into a narrative that makes meaning of that experience and communicates that experience. Or Daniel. Daniel was one who had the experience of dreams. And so when Daniel wrote, his narrative was a narrative that made meaning of the experiential dreams that he had. Now, these narratives and these God experiences have happened all across the global spectrum, not just to the 25% of humans who identify with the religion of Christianity. In other words, we can't say that this is our proposal, that you can't say that the only people that have had experiences with the divine are people that are in the religion called Christianity. That makes up 25% of the world's population. And before people get real upset about the other 75% of God's children actually having their own experiences and offering narratives about what that meant and what the meaning of ultimacy is, let's remember that, look, within the 25% that call themselves Christian, there are many experiences that are different within them. The Jehovah's Witnesses, the way they were founded, or the Mormons, the way they were founded. You can look at many of the denominated particularistic groups within Christianity whose narratives, in essence, differentiate and denominate them from all others who take on the identity Christian, and that only represents a total of 25% of the world's population. So narratives, there's a couple things we can do with the narrative, and of course we're going to go to part two. They can be particularized as specific to a religion. This is mostly how people think of narratives. For example, if you think Christianity, you think the Bible. In other words, the biblical narrative is a book about Christianity. The biblical narrative is a story whose outcome is Christianity. So when you think biblical narrative, you think Christianity, and that's why that biblical narrative only applies to some small percentage of the totality of the human family. Or they can be seen as pointers away from themselves to that which is ultimate. So if in fact a narrative is a story that is not pointing to itself, but pointing away from itself to that which is ultimate, that allows us to take a transnarrative approach to this Theology Without Walls project. And I'm going to clarify that, or attempt to anyway. I'll do my best to clarify it by using some diagrams here and some thinking. Let's start with the biblical narrative. That's what we come from. The biblical narrative. How do we take a transnarrative approach to the biblical narrative? Well, first of all, what is a narrative? Well, a narrative has a beginning and it has an end. So Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God. We have a beginning. Paul will write a very great summation to the Corinthians when he says, then comes the end. So here you see already I bolded both beginning and end to say that the biblical narrative has a beginning and it has an end. Now, this end is when Jesus, he hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed every ruler, every authority, and power. For he must reign, this is the reign of Jesus, until he has put all his enemies under his feet. That is happening in the transformational portion of the diagram we're going to look at. And the last enemy to be destroyed is death, which is separation thinking. Separation meaning God is other. My life is spent trying to achieve and maintain a God identity, trying to achieve that oneness with God. Paul goes on to say, for God has put all things in subjection under his feet. But when it says all things are put in subjection, it is plain that this does not include the one who put all things in subjection under him. When all things are subjected to him, then the Son himself will also be subjected to the one who put all things in subjection under him, so that God may be all in all. Once again, we're seeing that this is a transformative narrative whose purpose is to reveal God, God's ultimacy, and our relationship with God. And not just as a particularism, but that ultimacy or God in the biblical narrative is something that is all in all. And so if this God that we have faith in is a God that is all in all, what do we think about people in the East who say they've had experiences with the divine? People who are in other parts of the world that are not part of this narrative we come from. What about that? And immediately I can tell you that that statement is one that oftentimes causes people to draw up, because let's go back to our previous episodes. The natural tendency of the human ego and the human self as source is to attach to form for its identity. And the biblical narrative can become a form to which I attach, rather than a pointer that points away from itself to that which really is my identity beyond the narrative itself. And so what we're asking is, are there other narratives that we can sit down and talk through together to compare narratives, not religions? So I'm going to look at people that have contributed narratives from the Buddha and Buddha lineages. I'm going to look at narratives that have come through the Vedas and the Upanishads, from which the religion of Hinduism came. I'm going to look at those narratives, but instead of talking as, okay, as a Christian, I'm going to talk to a Buddhist and I'm going to talk to a Hindu, and we're going to compare religions. That is not what Jerry Martin was trying to get to. Jerry Martin is saying, wait a minute, how do we get the discussion beyond a person's religion to the ultimacy that we're all seeing? And that's where I'm saying a transnarrative approach is one where I want to look at the narrative of other teachings and compare it to the narrative that I myself have come from and have the greatest amount of time in and understand most deeply, because it is where I spend my time and meditate, but not because I see it giving me a particularistic identity. Rather, it is giving the world a universal identity. And so now this sets the stage for what about other narratives? So if I do my Venn diagram just to talk about this point that I made, I see the narrative as having a beginning and having an end. This biblical narrative starts in the realm of form, and the fulfilling work of Jesus as Christ individual and the body as Christ collective is transformed. So you have a narrative that brings an end to form and that is birthing all humanity into a new heaven and earth, which is transnarrative space. We no longer have anything beyond Jesus that reveals everything we need to know in the sense of our identity being God or Spirit as source. This is why the work of Jesus is said to be a once and for all role and function. So we have a narrative. That narrative points away from itself to the space of transnarrative. Once I get out to transnarrative, I term this space that I'm in today as co-creative space. I am co-creating my future along with God the Father. If I were applying this to the movement from childhood to adulthood, I would begin in childhood. The middle part of the Venn would be my teenage years, when I'm leaving childhood on the one hand and growing into adulthood on the other hand. But teenage years are so difficult because I'm still, getting out of childhood on the one hand while I'm just entering into adulthood on the other. But eventually I enter into adulthood. And what do I do in adulthood? I use everything I learned in my developmental psychological growth that came from childhood and teenage years. I now, as an adult, become a creator of my future. So I want to look at a chapter that was contributed by Dr. Paul Knitter. Dr. Paul Knitter contributed a chapter my Buddha nature and my Christ nature. Dr. Knitter is actually the author of a book, and its title is very provocative. It is, "Without Buddha, I could not be a Christian." Now, as a Catholic theologian, you can imagine that he has received criticism within his group for some of the things that he's considering. But he's not alone. The list of people that have done this type of comparative theology is very long. There are a lot of people that have compared Christianity and Buddhism and all these, and Taoism and other religions. And we're going to take a look at what he has to say about comparing the Buddha narrative and the Christ narrative. But people that actually talk to those who are in the East, and they're not just here in the West in their little Sunday morning gatherings with the walls all around them of their church building, people who get out of those boxes, those forms, people who are reaching out and looking at other human beings, are realizing that other human beings, as children of God, are having God experiences. This does not mean that we relativize all narratives. I am not saying that either. If somebody has a narrative that's all for beheading people, I'm out. I'm not going to go for a narrative where anybody gets beheaded, even though historically that has even been part of the Christian Inquisition and other things. So we know that that's been a part of most religious history. But the goal, Paul Knitter, just to read some of them, the goal of Buddhism is not just information, but transformation. Dr. Knitter has mentioned our magic word, that the role and function of Christ, the individual and collective, is transform. One might have to change not only one's ideas, but also one's religious identity, one's way of being religious. So he's already recognizing that as we begin to look at the role and function of these narratives, and it's pointing us to a universal ultimacy, that the walls begin to fall and we begin to move even beyond the particularism of a religion outcome of a narrative. He says this is salvation, not as an atoning process that takes place outside of oneself, which, by the way, Paul Knitter has recognized in his book, and I don't have time to go through all of these. Obviously, this is an overview, but Knitter has recognized that our paradigms and views of the atonement need to be rethought. And that's why I did a whole series on the atonement. He would be in agreement with that. We've got to relook at old atonement thinking. All of this is evolution in our spiritual consciousness. And he says this is not an atonement process that takes place outside of oneself, but a transformative unit of experience. Jesus saves essentially the same way that the transcendent Buddha saves. That's a statement that when you're attached to to Christology as your religion, that is very threatening. But Paul says, not by constituting the nature of mind or God's saving love, but by revealing and so making it effectively present. Meaning that the work of Christ, for example, like Buddha, would be to reveal God. And this is why the last contribution by the Apostle John is called the revelation of Jesus Christ. What is it that Christ is revealing? Christ is revealing that true identity is found in a new space called New Heaven and Earth, called New Jerusalem, and that space is God's space, and it is the space of ultimacy with which I relate my identity. Knitter goes on to say, in another functional analogy, both Buddha and Jesus can be considered liberators, as bearers of a message that can enable humans to achieve the well-being of what Buddha called enlightenment and what Jesus called the reign of God. We just talked about Jesus and the reign of God. We talked about the fact that Jesus had a transformative reign that was to defeat the last enemy, which was death. And death was separation. And separation comes through self as source. And the Buddha narrative is a narrative that is all about the problems of the self and attachment. That is, in essence, mirroring the same work that Jesus was trying to reveal about God. So Knitter says, what we really are, according to the teachings of Dharma, is anatta, not selves, beings who exist as interbeings with others. This, to me, is the work of the cross. Jesus is the last Adam, because from Adam to Christ, you have a death paradigm of sin and death. Sin and death can only exist in the realm of form. Sin is violation of the boundaries of form, and death can only happen in the realm of form because there is no way to have separation in formlessness. So Jesus puts to death the self as source, and this is again going right along the same lines as what Knitter is saying in the narrative from Buddha. So as I throw this out, all I'm saying is I would like to have more conversations with Paul Knitter and others who have this kind of a transformative diagram, if you will. This is mine, by the way, this Paul Knitter comparison. This is my comparison. This is not what Paul Knitter is saying. He might watch this video because I'm going to send it to him and say they don't agree with anything I'm saying, but I'm giving you my take on it. So the Knitter comparison would be that Buddhism recognizes that you begin in this realm of form, and that attachment to form and dukkha and suffering is what comes about in the first stages of consciousness that is in need of deliverance. When you get to transform, what's transform? One example of that I put in here is Buddha narrative has the Noble Eightfold Path. What is the Noble Eightfold Path? It is a transformative movement from suffering to freedom, enlightenment, the no self, anatta. The Noble Eightfold Path is like saying Jesus is the way, a path and a way. Those are words that are transformative. The way from and to, the path from and to. So the conversations I would like to have with people like Paul Knitter have to do with the ways in which ultimacy is understood, which I understand as God coming from the biblical narrative. And I want to know more about transformation as taught in Buddhism. There's a very popular book out by Eckhart Tolle, for example, The New Earth. A lot of these particular ideas of form and formlessness are in Eckhart's book, and he is making use of these Eastern principles. And he sees them also very much as principles that were applied by Jesus himself. So this is why we need to be having these discussions to say that universally across the planet, what's the nature of this formlessness? If you have a different narrative, all I want to know is, what does your narrative say about the nature of what I understand to be God? What does your narrative have to say about death? Sin is particular more to the biblical narrative, but the same concepts apply, and that is the problems that one has when they are attached to boundary-driven thinking through self as source. So I also want to bring up here Dr. Jeffrey D. Long, Jeff Long. He contributed a chapter to the book, Theology Without Walls. His chapter was A Hinduism Without Walls, ? Exploring the concept of the avatar interreligiously. So let's talk about this a little bit. Jeff grew up in Roman Catholicism eventually became very much involved with Hinduism, and now teaches in eastern Pennsylvania at Elizabethtown. He teaches Hinduism there. So Jeff says, as a scholar practitioner in this tradition, I can say that it is precisely its breadth of vision, its aspiration toward universality, that was one of the factors that drew me in. Well, Presence has a lot to say about universal identity, universal God identity, and that draws us as well. He goes on to say, though, in contrast with mainstream Christianity, Vedanta, a form of Hinduism, is not primarily about belief in the divinity of a particular teacher, but about the realization and manifestation of the divinity within us all. Jeff's already bringing up this idea of Christ, and is Christ God, and how does this thing with the Trinity work, and what is the point of the narrative? And Jeff is saying what attracts him is a narrative that talks and speaks to the manifestation of divinity within all of us. So when Cody and I go into our series after this on the Trinity, we will talk about what is the role and function of Christology with relation to Jesus and the divinity within us all, which has not been the emphasis. The emphasis has been divinity within Jesus, and Jesus is basically the trump card of the Christian religion because of it. Jeff goes on to say, there is a distinction, though, in Hindu traditions between one who ascends to the level of enlightenment and becomes God realized, in other words, becomes conscious of their true identity, or liberated in this lifetime. There's a difference in that, and a descent or avatara, the avatar of the Supreme Being. The avatar is the assumption of a concrete form by the Supreme Self, infinite being, or Supreme Reality for a specific purpose or mission. The classic avatars come to destroy evil and restore good. In Hindu thought, the conversation I would like to have is this. I see Jesus as transformative in his role and function. It sounds to me from the description of the avatar in Hindu religion that avatars are absolutely transformative figures as well. What is their purpose? To destroy evil and restore good. When I read that, one of the passages that immediately came to my head was Acts chapter 3 and verse 21, where Peter is saying about Jesus, whom the heavens must receive until the restoration, the restoring of all things that God spoke through the prophets. The work of Jesus was to restore. It was the restoration of all things. This was God's work through Christ as the transformative symbol that was happening within our planet. The same is true of reconciliation. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. So you have Christ as the way, once again, that God being the point, restored, reconciled, etc., and the destruction of evil is talked about in many different ways within the narrative as well. So I'd like to have more discussion with Jeff about his understanding of what the avatars, these people who were transformative figures in the Hindu narrative, in their writings, what exactly was the evil that got destroyed? Can we talk about that? What is its nature? What about restoring good? What is the good that you see in your narrative that is the end result with relationship to ultimacy? And for the narrative that comes from the Upanishads and the Vedas, the ultimacy or supreme reality is Brahman. And so you have, again, this idea of moving into this sphere that is perfection, this sphere of love, this sphere of reconciliation and the restoration of all things. Jeff says, Jesus, of course, as traditionally understood in Christianity, is a singular divine incarnation, the way, the truth, and the life, John 14:6, faith in whom is necessary for salvation. One of the things, apparently, that was a problem for Jeff as a Roman Catholic, and that was part of his movement into Hinduism, was the particularistic interpretation of John 14:6. And I say the particularistic interpretation because we must remember in previous episodes, Christology has been interpreted as either being traditional, modern, or postmodern. When you go back to the traditional era that dominated the first 1500 years CE, you're talking about the traditional age, which we would also associate today with all denominations within Christianity that are what we would call fundamentalists. And the more fundamental the viewpoint or the lens through which one looks at Christology, the more particularistic the verse will read about the way, the truth, and the life. I also believe that Jesus is the way, but I believe that he's the way to God's universal identity in all people, not a particularistic, traditional lens interpretation of that. And that's why we should be having these conversations with people who are put off by the interpretations that have been handed down through the world's largest religion because of the way Christology has been interpreted. So I said, let me do a Venn diagram for Jeff. I've already insulted you, Paul Knitter. Let me just go ahead and do something to Jeff Long as well here. This is my Venn of this. Jeff talks about the movement from egotism, and egotism as you read Jeff's work and in the Upanishads and whatever, we're still in that self as source, that self-attachment, that movement away from self is really universal to so many narratives in this world. Why is that? Is it a coincidence that all of God's children on all parts of the earth are intuiting, writing narratives about, and explaining similar trajectories of transformation? Aren't they all trajectories of transformation? If we look from the standpoint of it as a narrative, then when we get to transform, you have the avatar in the Hindu writings, and its purpose is to restore. What happens when you are transformed from egotism? You enter into nirvana, enlightenment, liberation. And think about this word liberation. Many times I've quoted from Paul's letter, Romans chapter 8 specifically, that the whole creation was anxiously waiting for its deliverance into the liberty of the children of God. And so you have this same idea of liberty, liberation, freedom, to be free in the realm of that which is formless. So once again, I would like to have these kind of conversations with Jeff Long. And again, perhaps we can get some of these folks on future podcasts where we can talk about what these different narratives point to. But I'm not using the narrative from the Buddha or from the Upanishads or from the Tao, from any narrative in order to become a Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, Taoist. I'm not using a narrative to have an outcome that's a religion. I'm using a narrative to say, what does your narrative say about the movement into ultimacy? What does your narrative have to say with what I would consider to be God? What does your narrative have to say about human bondage, and the movement into freedom and liberation. So those are some just little snippets from these writers, all of whom have contributed to Theology Without Walls. One final narrative I want to bring up in closing. This is my last narrative. I want to bring up science's narrative. What can science perhaps tell us is happening in the world right now? It is my feeling, and I'm not a scientist, most people would say, I'm sure not a theologian either, but most of what I'm saying is that in the era of modernity, there was a split between science and religion. Religion had, as boundary-driven thinkers do, defined the creation of the earth as 6 literal days. It had declared that the flood and Noah's Ark were literal stories, and on we can go with that. Well, that separation from religion was appropriate. But now what I feel like is happening is that science and spirituality, not religion, but science and spirituality are now converging, and that they are all narratives that make meaning out of that which is ultimacy. And here's what I mean by that. Science obviously started in the Newtonian age, in the realm of that which is quantifiable and measurable and observable, et cetera, et cetera. And so we had the Newtonian science that we started with, and you've got Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, and we know about time and space from Newton, and the way the galaxies work, and gravity, and all things Newtonian. But within the more recent times has come quantum physics. And in the quantum world, suddenly the subatomic world works on principles that are not the same as the principles in the Newtonian world. In fact, in the quantum world, instead of time and space, you have this idea of non-locality, where 2 particles that are on opposite ends of a galaxy can react simultaneously to a single stimulus, and that completely goes against the speed of light and all of those things that we would have in the Newtonian world. And so suddenly scientists are like, wait a minute, how can there be one set of ways of seeing things in our Newtonian macro picture of galaxies and planets and stars, and then when we get to the subatomic level, the quantum level, it's different. And scientists today are trying to figure out what's the bridge, where's the bridge. So what's happening is you get out into transform. What happens in quantum? I'll give an example of a photon. A photon, when it is observed, is a particle. When it's non-observed, it is a wave. That's the transformative part about quantum mechanics. In other words, if I observe a photon, it appears Newtonian, it's a particle, but unobserved, it's a wave, which to me is pointing toward that which is formless. As a matter of fact, one of the first things I thought about when I heard more about quantum theory was the words of Jesus in Luke, the 17th chapter. Jesus looked at everyone 2,000 years ago and says, the kingdom of God does not come with observation. And I thought, well, of course it doesn't. It's because it's toward the formless. It's like a wave. It has no beginning. It has no end. It's just a wave. And it doesn't come with observation. So now when we get out into the formless, what is that? Well, that's where I'm going to have a guest with me later on. I don't know how long it'll take for this to happen, but it's someone who's currently written a book on this subject, science and spirituality. And I'm a good friend of mine, and I've been talking to him about these things for about a year now. But when you get out to the formless, we're going to talk about David Bohm, B-O-H-M. Bernardo knows him well. And Bohm is a physicist who passed in the early 90s, but who began to suggest that the way quantum science is working and the inexplicable differences with Newtonian world, that perhaps there is something undergirding it all. And here's the mind blower. He even suggested that perhaps it is something that undergirds in such a way that it's even beyond science. Now all of a sudden, we are talking about narratives that, once again, whether they're science, whether they're Eastern narratives, whether they're Western narratives, we're talking about transformative principles that seem to be universal to all human beings. And I believe by taking a transnarrative approach where I'm not arguing about whose religion to belong to, I'm discussing the nature of God, ultimacy, the nature of love, unity, freedom, liberation, the putting away of the self as source, the putting away of the ego, egotistic, self-centered, greed, lust, etc. These transformative movements, we are now talking in a way that is contributing and not attempting to convert. We move again from a conversion to a contributing mentality. So that is my 2 cents worth on a transnarrative approach to spirituality. And that wraps up my series here on Theology Without Walls. And I hope that we will be able to discuss this more and more here at Presence with those of you who are theologians contributing to this field. And I thank everybody who has taken the time to watch these episodes. So I look forward to possibly talking to you all in the future. And again, thank you very much.